Charles M. Sheldon once said, "God gives us angry men in every age, men with indignant souls at the sight of wrong, men whose whole being glows with righteous rage, men who are strong for those who need the strong." John Brown has been one of the most controversial figures in the United States for over 150 years. From cold-blooded murderer to a martyr defending the innocent, no one can seem to put a definite answer to who Brown really was, but one thing is certain. He was one of the most important abolitionist figures throughout the course of the Civil War. John Brown was a martyr for the cause of slavery. Brown was born on May 9, 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut, to Owen Brown and Ruth Mills. He was the fourth of 8 children. When he was 5 years old, his family moved to Hudson, Ohio, where his father opened a tannery. Brown enrolled in a preparatory program in Plainfield, Massachusetts, after leaving his family at the age of 16. Later, he went to the Morris Academy in Litchfield, Connecticut, where he planned to become a Congregationalist minister. He was forced to give up the academy when he ran out of money, and he started suffering from eye issues. Brown then moved back to Ohio, where he opened up his own tannery with his adopted brother outside of town. In 1820, Brown married Diane Flusk. They had their first child, John Jr., in 1821. He bought 200 acres of land, and his family moved to Richmond, Pennsylvania, where he built a barn, cabin, and tannery. He made a living off of working in cattle and selling leather from his tannery, which eventually employed 15 people. Things took a turn for the worst when, in 1831, he became sick, his business began to suffer, and one of his children died. His wife died soon after the loss of their newborn son. About a year later, Brown married Mary Ann Day, who was only 16 years old. Together, they took their 20 children to Franklin Mills, Ohio, where Brown built another tannery on land that he had to borrow money to buy. Following the Panic of 1837, he eventually had to declare bankruptcy, and he and his family moved into a home across from the Perkinstone Mansion. He eventually left Ohio and settled in Springfield, Massachusetts. While Brown lived in Springfield, the United States passed the famous Fugitive Slave Act, which required the return of any slaves who were discovered running away from their owners, and it also demanded harsher punishments for the slaves discovered running away from their owners. In response to these laws, Brown formed a group called the League of Gileadites in 1851. Their purpose was to help prevent the capturing of slaves due to the Fugitive Slave Act. This was only the beginning of Brown's contributions towards abolition. After the group was formed, he left Springfield. At one point in time, Brown and his family lived in North Elba, New York, which was an all-black community. People thought him to be insane, but it was just one of his attempts at showing how harmless and humane black people really were. James Horton, a historian, said, "He is socializing and associating with blacks in this community. This is something unheard of for a white man to be doing in the middle of the 19th century." Most abolitionists were lukewarm, at best, on the notion of racial equality. A few other examples of Brown's generosity are that he donated some of his land to the fugitive slaves, even though he was financially destroyed. He and his wife took in a black child and raised him as their own, and he participated in the Underground Railroad, which was very risky considering the family he would be leaving behind if he got caught. Brown did not really want to start to attract attention until around 1855, when he and 5 of his sons moved to Kansas. The Kansas Territory was, at the time, being terrorized by pro-slavery organizations. In 1851, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, which dictated that citizens of the area would vote on whether or not they wanted the territory to allow slavery or abolish it. Some anti-abolitionists terrorized people who wanted to vote against slavery. For example, they would stand outside of voting areas and threaten to bribe people to vote for slavery. In May of 1856, Brown led a small group of men along the Pottawatomie Creek where they killed 5 pro-slavery men. Brown, of course, did not participate in the murders. This incident became known as the Pottawatomie Massacre, which brought Brown national attention. Settlers in the North claimed he was a brave hero. The South had a completely different view. They thought that Brown was a cold-blooded murderer and that he had no right to kill anyone. Owen, John's father, raised John and his siblings in a very religious lifestyle. One of their main beliefs was that, according to the Bible, slavery was a sin against God. Therefore, Brown believed that he was justified in killing these men because it was his God-given right to do so. Following the Pottawatomie Massacre, Brown traveled around the country for 2 years, planning another attack, this one in Virginia. During his travels, he was finding soldiers and raising money. Brown's planned target was Harper's Ferry, an arsenal with weapons. The whole point of the attack would be to gain weapons to give to slaves, who would eventually start a slave rebellion. The attack was supposed to happen sometime in 1858, but Brown heard news that one of his men was planning on betraying him. Some of his army soon lost interest due to their belief that the plan was not going to be successful. Even though he lost some members, Brown's determination led him to continue his plans. On October 16, 1859, Brown and his army of 18 men started for Harper's Ferry, armed with 200 pistols, 200 rifles, and 1,000 pikes. Brown's only order to his men was, "Consider that the lives of others are as dear to them as yours are to you. Do not, therefore, take the life of anyone if you can possibly avoid it." This statement proves that Brown's intention was not to violently kill as many men as possible. He only wanted to get the weapons and get out. The army first went into the fire engine house. Brown took many hostages, who he wanted to trade in exchange for slaves. He put local slaves in charge of watching the hostages, arming them with pikes, and he also ordered food from the local tavern to feed the hostages. The army cut the telegraph wires in the town. After that, they took control of the railway that led into the town. 3 men drove their train into town, despite warnings from townspeople. Brown's men shot and killed one of the conductors, who was the first to die in the battle. As soon as word spread around the town about what was happening, citizens armed themselves and militias from nearby came to fight Brown and his men. The militias took over the railway very quickly. When Brown understood his position, he locked himself, his remaining soldiers, and some hostages in the fire engine house. In Washington, D.C., President James Buchanan got word of the events at Harper's Ferry and sent backup forces. Brown's raid was quickly over when the U.S. soldiers entered the town. Brown was tried and convicted of treason in Charlestown, Virginia. He was also convicted of murder and of inciting a slave insurrection. 4 men from Brown's army who had not been killed during the raid were also convicted of the same charges. Brown was hanged on December 2nd, 1859. Although many people argue that John Brown was an insane, cold-blooded murderer, there is evidence that he was in a good state of mind. Virginia Governor Henry Wise wrote, after speaking with Brown for hours after his capture, "Brown is a man of clear head. He has inspired me with great trust in his integrity as a man of truth." Brown's actions at Pottawatomie and Harper's Ferry made him into a martyr in the eyes of Northerners. His lifelong dedication to the abolition of slavery amazed many people. Sometimes, violence is a necessary evil, especially in John Brown's case. His actions gave hope and encouraged other abolitionists to defend their beliefs. He also potentially sparked the beginning of the Civil War. Many other fights happened because of him. John Brown was a martyr. Without him, the North may never have gotten the motivation to fight for their cause. Also, the South may have never gotten the motivation to secede. Although he was called a murderer and a maniac, it has to be understood that sometimes blood is only a small price to pay on the journey to winning a much bigger and more evil cause.